Hi, this is Amy Sparrow, and the class that you're joining today is Dressing Like an Anglo Saxon Woman, a Beginner's Guide. I have been sewing for about 50 years, and I have a laurel in diverse arts, but it's mostly costuming and research. So early Saxon women's clothing is an area that I have just recently been researching over the past few months. And I wanted to share this with you because I think that if you're new at doing historically accurate clothing, Anglo-Saxon is a great place to start because a lot of the clothing is squares and rectangles. And in addition to talking about the clothing, I'm going to talk about the hair and the jewelry and the head coverings. So the goal of this class is for you to walk away with enough information to dress as an Anglo-Saxon woman for an event. So with that brief introduction, I'm going to share my slideshow and we'll get started. So, as I said, this class is Dressing as an Early Anglo-Saxon Woman, a Beginner's Guide. This class is about clothing worn by Anglo-Saxon women in Great Britain between 450 and 700 AD. And this time period covers from about the time the Romans left up until the conversion of the pagans to Christianity. So if you're not an archaeology expert, you might wonder how we know what people were wearing back then, especially considering that the time period in England between 450 and 700 was considered the Dark Ages. It's not called the Dark Ages anymore. It's called the Early Middle Ages. That's the kind name they use for it now. But the fact remains that many Anglo-Saxons were illiterate. So they didn't leave us a lot of information firsthand in writing about what they thought and what they were doing. We have contemporary sources on the continent where these people migrated from to use as a source. We have grave finds from England to use as a source. And we have various stone carvings and mosaics that we can use as a source for how people were wearing their clothes and jewelry. The other thing that you need to be aware of is in the continental Germanic tribes from the 5th to 7th centuries, women and men had the right to take their belongings to the grave. So if this was true of the Anglo-Saxon tribes in England, what we're seeing for grave goods are not what the mourners are putting into graves, but what the actual person owned and used and wore in their own lives. And that's really important when it comes to figuring out what they were wearing. As you can see by this image on the right-hand side of the screen, this is a brooch that was found in a grave. And as you can see from the pieces of textile on the back of this metal brooch, that's about the size of the textiles that we get from the graves in England. So there's not a lot to go by. The topics that we're going to cover today are dresses, the underdress, different kinds of ways to wear peplos, the brooches that were used to pin things in place, rings, beads, and necklaces for jewelry, wrist clasps, belts, belt pouches, hair, head coverings, and shoes. And all the images that you're going to see in this presentation are images of my friends wearing their Anglo-Saxon garb. This is a lady, Elise, who kindly took some photos of herself in her Anglo-Saxon garb. So fabrics, let's talk about fabrics first. Dresses were made from wool or linen. Twill appears to have been the weave that's most used. Very little fabric, as I said, has been found in graves, and therefore, as reenactors, we have a lot of room to make choices about the fabrics that we use. This image is another image of wool twill found on the back of a piece of metal. Now, let me have another disclaimer about this class. This class I would describe as a mile wide and an inch deep. And what that means is I'm going to give you just enough information so that you can make some correct choices about what you're going to wear. But each and every one of these slides that I'm showing you today, could be a class in and of itself. We don't have time for that. That's a PhD. Today, we're going to talk about just a little bit of every kind of topic. Now, dress fabrics, I am not a weaver, so I cannot talk in great depth about the weaving types, what a twill weave is, opposed to other different kinds of weaves. There is a ton of information out there for you to go research yourself. Let's go on to dress colors briefly. The Anglo-Saxons had access to a lot of the same colors that we have today: blue, yellow, red, purple, brown, and any natural color that a sheep's wool would have been. So what you want to do is go for the natural colors. Don't go for anything that's neon. That's a natural sort of thing that we've done with our dyes. Our ancestors didn't have access to neon type colors. What you want to do is think about woad is going to make a blue. It might make a dark blue. Then that would fade over time to a light blue. The same as yellow. Yellow is going to be dark at first, and then it's going to fade over time to a light lemon. Red matterwort is going to give you everything from tomato when it's first dyed to light pink after it fades. So that's the way that you have to think of your color spectrum when you're doing dyes or choosing a color of a fabric. So the first garment we're going to talk about is the base garment for any kind of female Anglo-Saxon outfit. It's the underdress. Now, if the dresses in graves were disintegrating before they were ever dug up, how do we know that they had long sleeve dresses that they were wearing? Well, very simply and conveniently for us, Anglo-Saxon women wore what were called wrist clasps or sleeve clasps, depending on who you're talking to. And that's what's pictured right here. These are the metal bits on each end. And then in the center, you can see the weave of the fabric that was pulled out from behind those sleeve clasps. So we know that at their wrists, they were wearing some kind of a sleeve, and thus that's where your long sleeve undergarment comes from, our knowledge of it. So that as a base garment leads us forward into the multiple ways that you can wear this thing called a peplos. So we'll start with the simplest one. Peploses are basically pieces of fabric that are pinned to your dress or pinned to each other and put over your head. And they're worn a lot of times with belt. So the first 4 Peplos types I'm going to show you are going to be Peplos worn with 2 brooches. And we're going to get to brooch types later because there's so many of them. So these 2 brooches are worn at the shoulders. And you can see Elise here. She's got her gray underdress on, and she's got 2 brooches holding up her peplos. Peplos garments were first worn by the Greeks and the Romans, and the Romans brought those peplos to Great Britain when they conquered Great Britain. We know they really didn't conquer it. They just sort of moved in for a few hundred years. And while the peplos became unfashionable for Romans after a time, the Anglo Saxons carried on with the style after the Romans left and went back to Rome. The peplos can be long, as you see on the conceptual drawing on the left, or it can be a bit shorter, as made by Elise. This next style peplos takes a heck of a lot of fabric. This peplos is basically sewn into a tube. You would take 2 pieces of fabric that are 1 3/4 yards long, 54 inches wide, and sew them together at their edges, or what's known as their selvages. And then you hem 1 inch along the top and 1 inch along the bottom. In the conceptual drawing, you can see the 2 brooches that would go on the shoulders, and then you see this little sort of flap here in the front of extra fabric. This is a lot of fabric to wear in the summertime. I made this out of mid-weight linen, and it's just too warm. Considering you're wearing about 3 3/4 yards of fabric just in the peplos, and then you're wearing another 3 yards of fabric in the underdress, that's as much fabric as you'd wear for a long sleeve German outfit made for the, Black Mountains in Germany. It's too much. Now, this next kind of peplos uses the exact amount of fabric. It uses the exact amount of construction. The only difference between this peplos and the previous peplos is that the previous was only held together by 2 pins at the shoulders. This peplos is held together by 2 pins at the shoulders, and then it's belted just below the bust line and then just across the hips. Now, I am 5'2". This is draped on my dress form, which is set for somebody who's 5'2". However, I would look like an Oompa Loompa if I wore this dress style. I am going to fast forward you to a slide towards the end of this presentation, just so you can see what this amount of fabric looks like when it's worn on somebody who is 5'9". There is my friend Karen, who was 5'9", and that's what that amount of fabric looks like on her. It's a completely different dress. So going back up to our peplos, we've come to the easiest style of a peplos worn with 2 brooches. The researchers have noted that this type of peplos appears to be open on either side, so you have easy access to your bags. Although researchers have figured out that Anglo Saxon women most likely wore their bags on the left side of their body because the grave goods and remains are set up so that she could access her pouch on the left side of her body. This peplos is only joined by pins at the shoulders, and it's made from 2 pieces of fabric. that are 31 inches wide by 61 inches long. And you have this nice flap that comes down over the front. Now again, this is set up on my dress form, and I am 5'2". I put this Peplos on a friend of mine, a different friend from Karen, who is also 5'9". And when you put this on somebody who's 5'9", guess what? This entire flap goes away, and the front and back are just connected by brooches touching the very top of the fabric in the front and the back. So it's really hard to tell you how much fabric you're going to need for your Peplos, because it varies so much given how tall you are. I want to note that the edge-to-edge fastening of this Peplos across the front of the neck, this is called the Anglican style. And I also want you to note that if you use this style with openings on both sides, they're not sewn together, this is going to give you a lot of variation in your wardrobe, because later on I'm going to show you how one of the pieces of that Peplos can be used for an entirely different look. So now we're going to move on to Peplos with one brooch. This is one of the simpler versions. This is a mid-weight linen that I used for this. It's sewn on, it's not sewn on one side. It's folded on one side and open on the other side. You can't see her brooch because it's a bad picture. I have to redo that picture. But this is a great example of what the SCA brings to clothing research, because somebody who was an archaeologist made this drawing and gathered all that fabric together and put it under one brooch. And I can tell you, when I gathered all that fabric together and put it under one brooch on this particular garment, it did not fit. The fabric was way too thick. So I can tell you with all certainty that using a mid-weight linen that's 3.5 ounces for this look does not work. You're going to have to use incredibly thin fabric to get your garment to look like this conceptual photo. So either the pin was much bigger than the pin that's shown here, or the fabric was much thinner, or both of those two in working together. As far as how much linen to use, Baroness Corinne is 5'2", and I used 2 yards of this fabric, it's 54 inches wide, and it was folded against the grain, which you generally don't do, but since this isn't a fitted garment, it doesn't matter. See, I told you, Anglo Saxon, easier than the average garb. So the second type of one brooch Peplos is got a flap here, just like we saw with the 2 brooch Peplos earlier. And I also would like to point out that there is another brooch that is mid-chest. This Peplos took 3 yards. It doesn't look like 3 yards, but it took 3 yards. This would also do better if it was a lighter weight, a handkerchief weight linen, as they call it. This third type of one brooch Peplos is what I call a Frankenstein dress. The conceptual drawing, I will break it down for you. You have your long under dress here. And then the first garment you have on underneath is a Peplos with 2 brooches held together. And then you have another Peplos on top of that. Now, if you will notice, the brooch on one side does not match the brooch on the other side. This is common in Anglo-Saxon burials. You don't always get brooches that match. It's perfectly okay, especially if you're buying your brooches secondhand at an SCA swap meet and you only find one that you like. That's perfectly fine. Buy it and then find another one of a different kind, and you're still going to be historically accurate with your outfit. Another thing I want to point out is this would be incredibly hot to wear unless it was wintertime. So if you like Anglo-Saxon and you want to wear it into the winter, this is an option for you. The last type of one brooch peplos is this type. And as you can see, I've taken one of those pieces of blue fabric that we used for the two brooch peplos earlier on, and I've just slung that over my shoulder and held it up with one pin. This is probably the easiest peplos in the entire presentation. And what this can do for you is it can keep your underdress from getting sullied if you're going to sit down on a log or on the ground or something like that. And you can see my little ring pouch. We'll talk about those later. This peplos is made from one piece of fabric that's 31 inches wide by 61 inches long. Now you may have noticed that I did not address how much fabric it will take you to make one of these underdresses. So I am 5'2" and I'm a little wide. It takes me about 4 yards to make this underdress. Now, I'm making an underdress for my friend who is 5'9" and quite slender, and it takes the same amount of fabric for her underdress. So go figure. You've really got to pattern out stuff for yourself. Let's talk about the stitches used to create these garments. And they're very, very easy stitches. And I wanted to cover this for those of you who like to do hand sewing and find it relaxing. Now, I know a lot of you are screaming in your heads right now that hand sewing is not relaxing, but believe it or not, there's some of us out there that like to watch TV and hand sew, and it's meditative. So let's talk about those stitches. These stitches used are the same stitches used to make Iron Age garments. And what they did was they basically finished off the edges of their garments completely before they actually sewed the pieces together. And that gave the garments more integrity. So the first thing you would do for two pieces of fabric that you want to sew together is you would cut them out. And then you would turn the edges back twice. And then you would whip stitch the edges down. This stitch is also called an overcast stitch. You're just whip stitching them down into place. Now, once you've done that for all your pieces for your outfit, you're going to go to step 2, which is to pin together the pieces whose edges you've already finished. And then you're going to whip stitch those pieces together along the areas where they join, like I've done here. And then when you're done with that, you flatten them out. And you can see the results are really quite clean. They are so clean, in fact, that you could wear an outfit inside out and it will look just as good as if you're wearing it right side out. The person who taught me this was a person who makes her Viking clothing by hand, and I was astounded at how wonderful all of this looked. Now, if I was doing this for real, I would not have used white thread on red linen. I would have probably used matching thread. However, if it was in period, there is a good chance that you would have been using white thread on whatever kind of linen or wool that you were using. You wouldn't necessarily have dyed your thread to match your garment. So with the sewing part out of the way, let's talk about brooch types. The Ashmolean Museum in Great Britain is a great place to get source material for brooches or about brooches. And I have 10 different kinds of brooches that I'm showing you today. But if you do your research, and again, this is another area that you could write a PhD paper in about types of brooches. I have a book that breaks down brooches into no less than 27 categories. And that's a little too much to cover for today. So for today, I'm just going to show you the different shapes of brooch that you would have. There's something called an annular brooch, where you would stick the fabric through here and then push a pin behind it to keep it in place. And then you have your applied brooches, where you have metal that's applied to a base. And you have your button brooches, which they look a lot like coins, don't they? They have a stamped design in them. You have a disc brooch, which appears to be another kind of stamped design. You have saucer brooches, where this is a full-on Sutton Hoo-like brooch with a bunch of inlays. And I just threw out that word Sutton Hoo. Sutton Hoo, Suttonhoo, is a very famous Anglo-Saxon burial, where a lot of the goods that we use for a basis for Anglo-Saxon jewelry comes from, and clothing as well. So the next slide is going to show you some fancier Anglo-Saxon brooches. Here we have a penannular brooch that's kind of a horseshoe shape, and it's got a little pin across the front. That's the simplest one. Then we go on to the radiant head brooches, the square head brooches, the cruciform brooches, and the small long brooches. These are, with the exception of the first brooch here, these are among the fancier brooches that would have been worn by high status Anglo-Saxon people. So I'm going to let you delve in to brooch research all on your own. I have a vendor listed under resources in the back of this presentation, so you know at least one person you can go to buy some of these kinds of brooches. Next, we're going to talk about sleeve clasps. Sleeve clasps held together the ends of your sleeves, much like buttons do on cuffs these days. This drawing is from Cloth and Clothing in early Anglo-Saxon England. The simplest sleeve clasp is a hook and eye, which I had a friend of mine make up for me. She's an artist who does wire work. And it's just simply a big hook and eye. And I actually have these on the dress that I'm wearing, and you can see the photograph on the slide. Also, let's see, item B18C can be purchased at Raymond's Quiet Press. That's the SCA vendor that I list in the back in the resources. By the way, the people that I list in the back as resources, I have no relationship with any of them. I'm just giving you a place to go to look for information. So now let's move on to faux wrist clasps. Sometimes the wrists of garments were embroidered with fake clasps. Now, if you can't afford clasps, or you don't want clasps, or you don't have a metal worker in your family group, then you might have embroidered your own sleeve clasps. And this, I believe, yes, this is from a Sutton Hoo find. That's the place that I mentioned previously. Alfred here has some fabric. That's not embroidery that she's got in her cuff. That's fabric. But again, it's a way of having some decoration on your cuffs that's not exactly sleeve clasps. So this discussion of embroidery is going to move us forward into another hotbed topic of Anglo Saxon research, and that is embroidery. Here is my good friend Khalib, and she is wearing a wool tunic that she did some wonderful embroidery on. She has a paper that she wrote about how she made the decisions about what to embroider on her tunic and the types of stitches that she used. She points out that the Anglo-Saxons were known for their skilled embroidery, even though we don't have very much of it left to us. So we're going on very little finds. We have the Bayeux tapestry, which many people know. We have the Mammon embroideries, which are the men with the faces you may or may not know about. We have Queen Arnegun's cuffs, and we have Queen Bathilde's shirt. And those are within our time period that we're discussing today. As Khalid points out, Bayeux tapestry stitch was used, laid and couch work was used, stem stitch, outline stitch, chain stitch, and split stitch. All of those stitches that you can look up online, on YouTube, and in any basic embroidery book. The designs of what you embroider, that's where things get a little iffy. Since we don't have a lot left to us, we don't know what was used. Khalid thinks that a lot of it was acanthus leaf motifs and architectural elements and animal repeats. I happen to agree with her, because a lot of the times in history, we see things happening on the written page or in the architecture surrounding us that are mimicked in the clothing that we wear. So I agree with her wholeheartedly about that. I have her page, I have her paper listed in the back in the bibliography if you would like to go read the fine print about embroidery. Let's move on to belts. Men, women, and children wore belts. However, the most elaborate belt buckles were usually found in male graves, which makes sense because they would want the status associated with a fancy belt buckle. Belts could be leather or they could be textile, such as wool or linen or hemp. Belts at the time were tablet woven. However, modernly in the SCA, a lot of people use inkle woven belts, which are not historically accurate, but they are affordable, and nobody's going to bat an eyelash at you for wearing an inkle woven belt. Sometimes textile belts had belt buckles, as shown here in this image below. You have a little round belt buckle there. I myself just tie my belt around my waist and I don't worry about a buckle because it's one less thing I have to worry about losing. So now that we are done talking about belts, let's talk about some things that we hang on to belts. Let's talk about ring pouches. Anglo-Saxons used ring pouches, which were made from fabric or leather and hung from the waist. Rings for the ring pouches, which are what survives in graves, were made from iron, ivory, antler, and most archaeologists think wood was probably used as well. But of course, the wood would have disintegrated in the earth that makes up Great Britain. There is some debate about whether the rings were covered with the bag fabric or left viewable, as in the middle bag on the next page. The bags appear to have been worn on the left side of the body as well. My friend Mar Dahl here is wearing a bag. These are some sample bags that I have made. There's a link to the instructions in the bibliography. The center bag is a bag that I made 5 or 6 years ago at Penzic in a class taught by my friend Khalid, and it is the bag that has sent me down this path to find out more about Anglo-Saxon clothing and also what was in Anglo-Saxon bags themselves, what the Anglo-Saxons carry around in them. I have a completely different class about Anglo-Saxon amulets, which were found in these bags. But that's another class for another time. I would like to point out that the rings used for these bags are of various sizes. This ring seems very small, and a friend of mine called this a monkey trap, where you would put something in the bag that once you grabbed it inside the bag, you wouldn't be able to pull out because the ring is too small. However, I want to point out this ring is 3 inches in diameter. The ring that I came across in my research, which was made out of the base of a stag's antler, was only 2.5 inches across on the inside. So either it was made for a child, and I don't know that any rings were found in children's graves. It's either a woman with a very small hand, or these bags were upended to get their contents out of. On the other end of the spectrum, you have this much larger bag, which I believe this is a 5-inch in diameter ring, which you would think things would fall out of very easily, or you would lose it into a pickpocket. I like the middle size best, but that's just a personal preference. You can make whatever size you want, and the instructions to this are found in the bibliography. Let's turn our attention now to jewelry. Beads. The Anglo-Saxons not only wore beads of their own manufacture, they wore Roman beads too, if they found them. The Anglo-Saxons seemed a bit preoccupied with old Roman sites, and they were known to pick up trinkets at these sites and use them as amulets, like belt ends or broken pins. And if they found Roman beads, they'd wear them as well. I have some sample beads here. They don't look that pretty because they've been in the ground for many hundreds of years. You can find great reproduction Anglo-Saxon beads on Etsy. I have a vendor in my resources for that. Beads are another area that is about as deep as the Marianas Trench, if you want to go that deep. There's just hundreds of styles of beads. If you like doing glasswork, this is a really fun area to get into beads are not that difficult to make when you compare it to, say, casting metal. But if you have any kind of breathing problems, maybe making beads isn't for you. Anyway, I wanted to show you this is the tip of an iceberg. Again, there are great bead books out there that you can find that are going to show you what Anglo-Saxon beads look like more than what's just on this page. So what did we do with beads? Well, we would make them into necklaces. Necklaces can be as simple or as elaborate as you want. An elaborate necklace would usually mean a wealthier woman and vice versa. All of these beads here they were made on a professional torch, most of them, which is, I don't have the setup for that at home. I actually went to a location and made beads there. But also you can buy beads. This very simple necklace is made from a purchased beads. These yellow beads are stand-in for amber. I just want to have a side note about amber. Anglo-Saxons appeared to be obsessed with amber. They thought amber had curative powers. And even though you can't get amber in Great Britain naturally, they would have had to have traded for it from, say, the Baltics. There were a lot of amber beads found in Anglo-Saxon graves. As a matter of fact, the most beads that are found in Anglo-Saxon graves are made out of amber. So this could be a very simple necklace for you. If you're just starting out, you can cobble together. This is a cowrie shell. These are some glass beads. This is a bead of jet. This is a purchase bead. Very simple, all very appropriate. And before you go out and you spend money acquiring or making all these glass beads, let me tell you, this necklace is as heavy as sin, and I wouldn't want to wear it on a hot day. I would rather go for something like this over here. So let's talk about rings and bracelets. Anglo-Saxons thought that rings had curative powers, and they were magic. Knot rings were found in mid-6th and 7th century women's graves, and knot rings were supposed to confuse people trying to give you the evil eye, because the person giving the evil eye got lost in the swirls of the knot. As you can see by the image on this slide, there is a reproduction ring there in the center, again, made by my friend Bruna. Gold rings were used to cure eye problems. I have an article written about gold rings being held up to somebody's eye, and if you look through it, you're going to cure whatever problem your eye has. Iron rings were used against evil spirits. There is a long history of iron being used against fairies on the continent. And then bracelets. There's many kinds of bracelets. We don't have time to go into all the different kinds of bracelets that could be worn by Anglo-Saxons. I'm just giving you this simple example in the diagram that a bracelet could be as simple as bent wire. Now, I'm not saying this was simple to make. I certainly couldn't make this kind of bracelet. But if you find a wire worker like my friend, they could put together this bracelet for you, and it's not going to be as heavy as cast metal. To continue with our discussion of jewelry, we're going to talk about coins and chatelaines. You may or may not know, the Anglo-Saxons did not use coins for money. They used them for jewelry. Again, this is where they would go around the countryside, and if they saw a Roman coin, they would pick it up. They'd either drill a hole in it, or they would add a loop to it, and they would wear it on a necklace. This particular coin has both holes drilled into it and a loop added onto it. Another way to wear beads, coins, and shells was on a chatelaine suspended from the waist. The remains of one is shown in this diagram at the right. You can see you had pairs of beads and coins and at least one shell here. And these would have been suspended either by a woven braid or perhaps a thread, or more likely a leather thong, and it would have been worn from your waist. It would make a nice jingly sound as you walk, that's for sure. So now we're going to move on from the purely decorative to the useful. Spindle whorls. If Anglo-Saxons could find a Roman glass spindle whorl, and as you can see from the photo, they're very pretty. They might use it as a toggle on a belt pouch, or they would use it as a spindle whorl of their own. And spindle whorls were also considered magic. And as you can see, you've got a magical spell on this page. For cheek disease, take the whorl, which a woman spins with, bind on his neck with a woolen thread, and rinse within with hot goat's milk. It will be well for him. So yes, we have this magical spell using a spindle whorl. Hanging a spindle whorl just as a spindle whorl from your waist is also appropriate because it's a tool that you would want with you and you would probably be using a great deal of the time if spinning was one of your occupations. So now that we're done talking about the accessories for the most part, we're going to talk about hair. This is one of the reasons that dressing Anglo-Saxon is really good for people who are just getting into historically accurate dressing. Here is my friend Karen, who has some long, gorgeous hair. And these are fashions that have been described in some of the Anglo-Saxon research books that I've used. Your hair could be fastened just in a ponytail at the nape of your neck. You could also wear just a simple headband, or you could wear it parted down the middle and loose across your shoulders. This is great for people that don't like head coverings. On the next slide, my other friend, Karen, is showing us some braided techniques that were left over from the Romans. But first, we're going to talk about this very strange description of a burial where hair was pulled across the temple and then the rest hung down behind the ears. Now, we don't have her hair behind her ears in this photo, but you get what I'm saying. Now, Corinne is a professional hairstylist, and she found this description of a hairstyle very perplexing and didn't quite understand why it would be done this way. So I'm thinking either the archaeologists described it incorrectly or we're not understanding quite what they meant. The other styles on the page are braids. And you see an elaborate braid that she did on somebody at Penzic. And then you see her wearing her own hair in braids. And then another Roman style in her salon chair. I have another page of hair descriptions that I will eventually get pictures for. Captured Germanic women wore their hair loose and shoulder length or in a bun at the back of their neck. And then you have two descriptions of what I would consider Roman hair still being worn by the Germans. They either roll it up and put it in a hairnet or a bonnet, or they curl it away from their face and it disappears under their veils. For those of you out there like me who have very short hair, a more appropriate way to wear it when dressing Anglo-Saxon would be to cover it up. These are called migration period veils. Now, migration is a time where the tribes were moving from the continent of Europe across the sea into Great Britain. And they treated their veils. Modernly, we think veils are white, and that's not the case historically. They were colored, they were decorated, they were pleated, they were worn many different kinds of ways. And that's what we have in migration period veils. So if you like to be fancy, you want to fancy up your outfit, a very colorful veil is a way to do it. Now, I'm not talking color in terms of a pattern. I'm talking a color as in a solid color, and then maybe you would embroider the edge of it as shown by the woman in the upper drawing. After the migration period veils, we're going to go on to the head coverings based on Viking finds. These are finds that are based on pictures from Dublin archaeology. Now, Vikings came after the Anglo-Saxons or contemporaneously with them later period. I'm not sure how early this kind of head covering would go, but I'm gonna go for it. I'm gonna assume something was probably around a couple hundred years before it was documented. So we have the first type, which is called, I call it a gnome cap. If you see it from the side in this drawing, it's very faint. There is a small dotted line here. And that's what makes this peak in this diagram here, in this picture, this photo of me. Then you can add a headband to it, which I have had added here, and which I'm literally wearing in the class right now. And then on top of that, you can put a veil. Now you can wear any one of these individually if you like, and you'll be perfectly fine. So as you can see, we have 4 slides worth of hair options, and mix and match as you please. So let's turn to outerwear. I haven't made up any outerwear for this presentation because it's currently in the 80s right now outside, and I don't want to make outerwear. I'm perfectly happy making very thin underdresses for events. But these outerwear cloaks would have been worn for wintertime, obviously. They would have been wool, or they would have been fur, or they might have been leather. A lot of the times it's rotted away, and all we have left with are the brooches, which you see here. So skipping over outerwear because it's not the right season at the moment, we're going to move on to shoes. No Anglo-Saxon shoes have been found in late 6th and 7th century graves. So what we use for a model is Iron Age shoes, which are made from a single piece of skin or hide with cutwork loops along the edges so that thongs can be threaded through. A pair of fragmentary leather shoes was found at Sutton Hoo, but I haven't seen a drawing for them yet. Oh, no, I'm sorry, take that back. It's on the next slide. Here's some drawings for some shoes. I don't know how much shoe research you guys have done out there, but I can tell you that even though these first two shoes, A and B, are listed from Denmark, I have seen Roman shoes in museums that are very close to what is listed for A and B. I can believe that C would have been a bog find in Ireland. And I can tell you that these turn shoes are very close to what is found in early Tudor shoes. And this boot looks Viking to me. So we are spanning all the way from Roman all the way to something that would look good in early Tudor times. And I am going to go with you use what you can afford. You can use what's comfortable. You have a wide variety of shoes to choose from. So with that, I want to summarize what we've talked about today. For those of you who are beginners in the world of historically accurate clothing, Anglo Saxon garments are a great place to start. Dresses and peplos are made from rectangles with very little shaping. The dresses have some shaping if you like set-in sleeves like I do, but if you're making a tea tunic, it's all about the rectangles, baby. Textile belts are appropriate, don't cost much. Simple ring pouches are easy to construct. A single glass bead is enough for a necklace. And uncovered hair is historically accurate in this time period, whereas in a lot of other time periods, it is not historically accurate. So I hope this has been useful for you. And I want to open the floor to see if we have any questions at all.
Hi, Amy. I have just one question. Even though I'd love to get a little walk through your bibliography and resources, could you go back to the faux wrist clasps?
Sure.
That just looked really interesting, but I didn't understand them completely. Was
Okay.
this just, I mean, it looks like the piece that's closer to the hand on the drawing there is something, but what
So
is
this
that?
is an underdress.
Oh, that's the sleeve of the underdress.
That's the sleeve of the underdress, and then you
Okay.
have the tunic that's on the outside. So I don't know if you know, I think you know about Middle Eastern clothing.
I know nothing.
Oh, you don't? Okay. So on Middle Eastern and on Russian clothing, they have this type of clothing of closure in the front. It's usually a toggle and a piece of thread that goes around it. And that's sort of the kind of aspect that you're getting here, a fake toggle closure. So that's what that's meant to be.
So that's embroidery that looks like something that would be practical, but it's
Yeah,
not. It's just showy.
correct.
All right, and we have this reproduction from the Sutton Hoo um burial find.
Yep,
So we know it happened.
we know it happened.
Okay. All right.
And I would believe that it is real as well. And so let me throw in something that I meant to throw in here at this point, and I forgot.
Mhm.
Apparently, so in Anglo-Saxon culture, if a woman from outside the clan gets married, she moves to live with her husband's clan.
Mhm.
So the men are the metal workers and the women are the embroiderers.
Mhm.
So the women are going to bring with them their knowledge of spinning and weaving and clothing construction. And the men are going to be the people that are making the metal work. So that's why you see in grave finds, you see the same clothing sort of traveling all over the country, the same types of clothing, because the women were moving around. But for metal finds, sometimes they're very specific to locations in England. because the men did not travel around. It was the women who traveled around.
Wow.
Yeah. Just read that yesterday.
That's cool.
And that simply wouldn't have occurred to me. But when I read about the fact that people had faux wrist clasps, and I read that, I thought, well, maybe people are embroidering wrist clasps because whoever was doing the metal work in that particular little town or clan died. They didn't have access to somebody who was doing metal work, and maybe that's why they chose to do it with embroidery. Who knows? Who knows?
Wow.
So was that the only question you had?
Oh, that's the only question for now. I would love to get a walk through your resources.
So this is my bibliography. It is by no means all. If I put some thought to it, my bibliography would probably be twice as long, and I need to put some thought to it for a more involved class. I want to point out that some of these things, like the Ashmolean Museum, that's free, 100% free online. This archaeological report, also free online. Patty's Papers, this is Khalid the Green-Eyed, free online. This book, Viking Age Head Coverings from Dublin, when I bought it, it was $50. It is now $850. So I believe that you can get this online for free now. You just have to look for it. Audrey Meany, she wrote the tome about Anglo Saxon magic and amulets. This book is no longer in print. I got it through interlibrary loan. This dress in Anglo Saxon England, it is somewhat pricey, but still available at libraries. This journal entry is free online. You just have to know where to look for it. And I have the link here. And this excellent book, Cloth and Clothing in Early Anglo-Saxon England, I devoured. If there was one resource that I would tell somebody to go and read if they really want to do Anglo-Saxon, it would be that particular book. So that's my bibliography, but I will expand that as I work on this class some more. I do have a personal thanks to all these particular people who were the models in this PowerPoint, or they were people that told me where to get resources. And I've used them all by permission, of course. And then the last page is resources. Again, I don't get any compensation from any of these people, but I do know that they sell things that will help you if you want to get into Anglo-Saxon historically accurate clothing. And that's where we wrap up this evening's presentation. So thank you for being there. And I hope to give you more information soon.
Thank you, Amie. That was lovely.
You're welcome.
All right.